Hey guys, it's me Kevin, and today I'm back with another sports video, and today it's going to be about sacked Australian coaches. It's been death row in the A-League in the last 3 weeks, with Newcastle's Ernie Merrick, Melbourne's Carlos Savacha, and Western Sydney's Marcus Babbel all sacked in the last 3 weeks. Many coaches are getting sacked, and there are polarised opinions about whether the coaches are getting the sack too early or not. Today, I'm going to have my take on the topic. The case which astounds me the most is Marco Kurz's sacking at Melbourne Victory. He was sacked after just 13 games, not even half a season, at Melbourne Victory. Now, usually you have to be a really awful coach to get sacked midway through your first season. I mean, even Mike Mulvey, and he lost like 17 games in 21, even didn't get sacked as quick as that. And Marco Kurz, look, he wasn't the best coach, admittingly, and Melbourne Victory were disappointing considering where they have been in the last few years. But it's not as if Melbourne Victory were the worst team. Far from it. There were teams that were playing worse football at the time than Victory. And in Marco Kurz's last game, they were actually up 2-1 in stoppage time before conceding 2 penalties. And what if Marco Kurz hadn't thrown a fit and he didn't get red carded off? Would have he got sacked after that game, or would have they just let him coach a little longer? I think considering that Melbourne Victory were showing signs of improvement with a draw against Wellington and consecutive wins to City and Newcastle, the latter being a 4-0 drubbing, I think Marco Kurz was sacked too quickly, and I think he probably should have stayed for a bit longer. Ernie Merrick's case was a little bit complicated, given that in his last 4 games, Newcastle conceded more than 4 goals on 3 occasions, which included a 6-2 drubbing to the Glory. And at the time of his sacking, they were firmly rooted at the bottom of the ladder. I think the other reason why he got sacked was his refusal to get other players through in the January transfer window and fielding young kids instead, in the wake of an injury crisis, which included injuries to Herrero, Nigel Boogaard, and Wes Hoolaran, who was their marquee signing, who got injured in the FFA Cup match. I probably would have kept Merrick, maybe, because I guess at their best, they are competitive, but at the same time, 4-0 drubbings, yeah, it didn't seem to be a good time for Newcastle, but I'm not sure if patience was needed, given that he can be a good coach at his best, and he did lead Newcastle to a grand final. I probably would have kept him personally and wait to see until after the injured players come back, and if they continue to perform poorly, then, yeah, he probably should have got the sack. Marcus Babbel was obvious, because on paper, his squad does look relatively talented, or competitive at least, but 10 wins in 40 matches, including just 4 wins this season, and 3 of them were in the first 3 rounds. I guess the board lost patience with Marcus Babbel. That is sort of understandable, considering the squad they've got. But, yeah. So, I guess in a case like Marcus Babbel, action was necessary, considering they were underachieving. But in Newcastle and Melbourne's case, I think they pulled the trigger too early. Now, this leads me to the question: should coaches get sacked? Now, obviously there are cases in which they do need to get sacked. A good example of this was Kenny Lowe with Perth Glory. In his 4 seasons, they finished 3rd, and then they got kicked out of the finals due to salary cap issues. Then he also coached them to consecutive semi-finals losses, and then in his last season, they missed the finals altogether. And Glory did have a lot of good players. I mean, players like Taggart, Keogh, and then in the back, Lowry, Davidson, Kilkenny. They had a lot of quality players, and they were only achieving, at best, semi-finals appearances. I guess in that case, yeah, Kenny Lowe needed to get sacked, because he was given 4 years to be able to coach a really strong Perth Glory side, and he wasn't doing it to the maximum potential. And that was evident when Tony Popovic took over. They shot up into premiership contention. Well, actually, they shot him up into a premiership trophy straight away. So, yeah, that essentially shows that, yes, Kenny Lowe's time was up. In Marcus Babbel's case, look, it was only a year and a half, but at the same time, when you look at the circumstances they were in, a new home ground, a relatively talented squad, yeah, I think Marcus Babbel, don't get me wrong, I think he was a good guy, but I do feel his coaching tactics and lack of game plan kind of cost his spot. Warren Joyce, at first glance, would have been a questionable sacking considering he coached them to consecutive finals appearances, but I guess with the fallout of Fornaroli and the toxic culture at City at the time, I think maybe his sacking was necessary, but that was for different reasons. That was due to a cultural issue. I will do a bit of cross-coding into the AFL here, because I know a lot more about past coaches, like dating back about 10 years compared to the A-League. I can only really speak for about 3 years. One coach which I think should have been sacked a long time ago that is still coaching somehow is Ken Hinkley. And I do think he will get sacked because I doubt the Power will make another finals appearance. I do feel that Port Adelaide have a really talented squad, yet they've missed the finals in 4 out of the last 5 years and haven't won a final since 2014. So I do think Ken Hinkley should have been booted around 2016-ish. Because the Power have been an extremely disappointing side. However, there has been a big example of impatience shown in the A-League, and there is no better example than that of Marco Kurz. Twice. First at Adelaide United, the board refused to renew his contract because, despite pretty obviously having secured a top 6 spot, Adelaide were struggling compared to the other top 6 contenders. However, they ended up finishing 4th on the ladder and getting a home elimination final, and they were 1 penalty away from getting into the grand final and playing Sydney in the grand final. And just imagine if they did make the grand final. Marco Kurz would have made the board look stupid. He already did, actually, but would have made him even more stupid. And then he went to Melbourne Victory, and he wasn't the worst coach. I can't say he was the greatest, but at the same time, Melbourne Victory weren't the worst of teams at the time. It's just because of their high-profile status and that people like Mark Bosnich and other sports commentators were accusing Victory of being disappointed because they're the biggest club in Australia. And essentially, an average return of results saw him sacked. I mean, if he was coaching Newcastle, I bet you he would have gone under the radar and he'd still be coaching, even if they were producing the same results. So, yeah, I think there was a lot of impatience shown with Kurz. I'll say one thing. Being an AFL supporter for about 10 years now, I will say one thing about coaches, and that some of the patience that they have shown have been quite phenomenal. I mean, Chris Fagan, in his first year, he coached Brisbane at just 5 wins. And then the next year, another 5 wins. And then, in 2019, shot Brisbane straight into 2nd spot. And the reason is because in those first 2 years, he was building the club so that they could just shoot up the top soon after. And they should have been minor premiers, actually. If it hadn't been for a Michael Walters after the siren behind, Brisbane would have won the minor premiership. In A-League terms, that would have been a premiership. And then there's been success stories like Damien Hardwick for 9 years. No, not that long, actually. For 7 years, sorry. Damien Hardwick, well, it was kind of on and off for him. In 2 years, Richmond looked extremely poor, and I bet you if he was coaching an A-League club, that would have been it. He would have been sacked. And then in 2013 to 2015, coached Richmond of 3 consecutive finals appearances, although nothing spectacular in those 3 years. Then in 2016, Richmond had a shocker of a year, an 8-win season, culminating in a 100-point loss to Sydney. If he had somehow miraculously kept his job until that point in the A-League, that would have been it. He would have been sacked. And in 2017, he was actually under immense pressure, and that if he didn't make the finals, he would have been sacked. Instead of getting sacked, he ended up becoming a premiership coach that year. And now, 2 years on, he's coached them to, in A-League terms I'm talking here, 2 championships and a premiership in his last 3 years. So, and at the moment, he seems to be one of the best coaches, if not the best coach in the AFL at the moment. Nathan Buckley. Now, this one was a little bit of courage. I wouldn't recommend this usually, and this was probably a one-off here, but I'll say this anyway. Nathan Buckley in 2017, an arrogant coach, and four years missing out on the finals, and he was pretty much sacked. He was pretty much going to end the season, and they were going to terminate his contract. Except, in his last 7 games, Collingwood won 5 games, and for some reason, the board decided to give Nathan Buckley one last shot at an AFL coaching role. And the next year, he coached Collingwood to a grand final. And if it hadn't been for a moment of brilliance from West Coast's Dom Sheed to put them in front with 2 minutes to go, Collingwood would have been with a championship or a premiership in AFL terms. I bet you AFL viewers watching this will be like, stop using this in A-League terms, just talk AFL terms here. And probably the biggest story of all was when Alistair Clarkson was down 1 win and 6 losses in 2010 and were 3 points away from losing to Richmond. They only just won that game. And apparently, if he had lost that game, rumour was widely believed that Alistair Clarkson would lose his job. They won that game just by 3 points. And then, later on, he coached them to 3 straight premierships between 2013 and 15, and also coached them to 2 minor premierships in 2012 and 13. So, and this made Alistair Clarkson dubbed as the best masterclass coach of the AFL. And between him and Damien Hardwick would remain as the 2 best coaches in the modern era. Modern era, I mean this decade. If Alistair Clarkson was sacked, it would have been a more classic case on impatience with the board. He had just won a premiership with Hawthorn 2 years ago, and after that he missed the finals. So essentially the board were getting frustrated with him. I guess in Damien Hardwick's and Nathan Buckley's cases, it was a little bit overdue, and I do think that it was over-the-top courage shown in their cases. But Alistair Clarkson, if he was sacked, it would have been a good example of impatience with the board. A more recent example of patience with the board is Tony Popovic's, okay? I know what you're thinking. What, he just coached him to a premiership, and that was probably one of the main reasons why it wasn't really panic stations in the early parts of the 2020 season. But after 8 rounds, the Glory failed to notch a win against teams like Brisbane, Newcastle, Central Coast, Melbourne. They only won 1 game from 7 and were on the bottom of the ladder. And as I said, they had lost to teams that they probably should have won, teams that were close to the bottom of the ladder. I bet you if it was another coach at another team, I bet you he would have gotten the sack or he would have been put under immense pressure. But Tony Popovic, as good as he is, was able to build the team, and they had a shock upset win against Melbourne City in round 9, and then from there, they haven't looked back since. They have won 6 straight victories, a club record, and Perth Glory are probably the second favourites behind Sydney FC to win the championship later on in May. So, I've given a few examples of good reasons to sack a coach and bad reasons to sack a coach. So, what do you think of the topic? Do you think A-League coaches sack their coaches way too quickly? I find they do, because I've been supporting AFL for 10 years, and usually they leave their coaches about 3 or 4 years before they actually sack the coach, so I guess I'm used to that system. But what do you think? Do A-League sack their coaches too quickly, considering there is no promotion and relegation? Because in the EPL you understand, because promotion and relegation, and if you get relegated you lose a lot of money. But in the A-League, given it's a closed market system, I don't think it's necessary to sack coaches as quickly as it is at the moment. So, comment what you think of it down below, and comment what you think of my recent videos. Please give a thumbs up, and please subscribe to this channel, and share this channel with other people, and I will be making another A-League round in review episode next week. Sorry, not next week, in 2 days' time. I'll see you in that video. Bye.